still. And it's a pleasure to welcome you and to introduce our speaker today. Lane Kenworthy is professor of sociology and the Yankelevich Chair in Social Thought at UC San Diego. He studies the causes and consequences of living standards, poverty, inequality, mobility, employment, and a number of other issues in the U.S. and elsewhere. And he's the author of multiple books, including most recently one entitled The Good Society, which is also the title of a course that he's teaching to some lucky UCSD undergraduate students this quarter at his home campus. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation and others. He received his BA from Harvard and his PhD from the University of Wisconsin. One interesting fact that he'll probably be surprised that I'm mentioning is that he was a participant in the National Youth Soccer League, and one of his short papers was entitled, "Are Barcelona the Best Soccer Team Ever?" That will not be his topic today. His topic today is social democratic capitalism, and we look forward to hearing from you, Professor Kenworthy.
Thank you. So let me know if this, I trust the mic is working if I don't hear otherwise. So I could, I happily, well, maybe not so happily talk about Barcelona right now. It hasn't been a good season for what I actually do think is probably the best team ever. Separate conversations. Here's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm working in most of my academic research for now 20-ish years or so has been encompassed by this question. I'm essentially interested in trying to figure out what institutions and policies alone and in configurations get us to something like a good society, get us to good societal outcomes, which includes everything from low poverty to high employment to economic growth, happiness, health, and on and on. And I'm going to say a little bit about how we might think about prioritizing or not prioritizing. So this is the question that drives me, and I'm working on this book now called The Good Society. It's a massive, sprawling thing. I'll mention that in a second, too, and also teaching a course this quarter. So, as I just said, my prior research, these are the books I've done up till now, all have grabbed at a piece of this very broad, very large puzzle. And I'm now doing this thing which I'm just putting up online chapter by chapter. There's some 35 or so out of 70 or 80 planned chapters up online. They're all intended to be readable individually. You know, they're on everything from poverty to political polarization to religion to civil society and so on. So if you're into this kind of stuff, take a quick look. You might find something of interest or that you can use. Okay, let me start with the question of what is it we want? Lots of things. How, if at all, can we prioritize these? Well, I tend to, rightly or wrongly, I tend to start with roles. I'm, as I said in talking to some of you just a few moments ago, I think of myself as kind of a loose Rawlsian. I think he offers a pretty persuasive way of thinking rigorously about this. So what does Rawls say we ought to prioritize among that lengthy list, which is surely an incomplete list that I just had on the screen a moment ago of possible goals or aims in a good society? Well, he says a set of basic liberties, equality of opportunity, and distributive outcomes that pay special attention to the least well-off. I think this makes some sense. I would add economic security. I think Rawls probably would too if he were writing now instead of 50-ish years ago. We know now what we didn't know then, which is, at least we didn't know very systematically then, which is that people experience loss more profoundly than they do an equivalent gain. That is to say, if we get divorced, we feel sadder than the happiness we felt when we got married. If we get fired, that reduces our subjective well-being more than getting hired, increased it. We also observe, both across people and countries and over time in the lives of people and the historical experience of countries, that as we get more money, that is to say, as we get richer, we tend to buy more insurance. that suggests a revealed preference for reducing insecurity of various types. So I would add security to this list of economic security to this list of things that we would prioritize. But I don't want to make a really strong argument along these lines. I just want to suggest this as a starting point. Okay, I think all of the rich democratic, long-standing democratic countries, which are the ones I'm going to focus on, meet the basic liberties criterion to a greater or lesser extent, but I'm going to largely set that aside and focus on, and due to lack of imagination, I'll just call this an expanded Rawlsian notion of what we ought to prioritize and say it's economic security, it's a distribution favoring the least well-off, it's equality of opportunity. Not that health and happiness and so on are not important. I want to suggest that a high employment rate at this moment in history is a good thing to add to this list for a variety of reasons. One is that it assists in achieving those other three goals, the equality of opportunity, the economic security, and a distribution favoring the least well-off. I think it's important in funding the types of public social programs that can help achieve those three things and other good outcomes. I think a high employment rate, and you see this certainly in the United States, but also in other countries too, can help avoid divisive political debates about reciprocity and pulling your own weight and makers and takers and so on. And I think we have emerging evidence that employment facilitates flourishing and individual happiness. We know with great certainty that unemployment, that is wanting a job and not being able to find one, reduces subjective well-being. There's emerging evidence that employment actually produces it. That is to say, you tend to be happier or more satisfied when you're in a paying job than someone who even doesn't think they want one, so someone who's just entirely out of the labor force. But that's pretty new, and I don't think it's a slam dunk yet. At some point in the future of human history, I think it's pretty likely, for sure, but I think it's pretty likely that artificial intelligence is going to get good enough that robots will be just as effective at human beings at doing even complex in-person service types of tasks that we now think robots can't possibly do as well as humans. When that happens, because they will also be a lot more reliable, they won't get sick, they'll show up for work every day. You won't have to pay them very much, they won't threaten to unionize, probably. They will replace a lot of human labor, and at that point I think we need a universal basic income at a pretty high level along with an array of services. But I'm going to set that aside because I don't think we're near there yet. I think we're, as I said a moment ago, still in a phase where a high employment rate is pretty necessary. I also think relatively robust, at least solid economic growth is useful in part because of it contributes to achieving those three core priority goals, expanded Rawlsian goals, but also because I tend to believe Benjamin Friedman's conclusion in this book he wrote about 20 years ago called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, that humans tend to be more altruistic and more willing to embrace creation or expansion of public social programs that contribute to a lot of good outcomes when they think the economy's doing reasonably well. When the economy's not doing so well, and yes, there's the major historical exception of the Great Depression period, but it really is an exception to the more general pattern. When the economy's not doing so well, people tend to care more about their own well-being and be less altruistic and so on. So I think solid economic growth doesn't have to be fantastic economic growth. That's an important route or means to these three ends. Okay, so restating the question, what are the institutions and policies that are most likely to get us to an expanded, so-called expanded Rawlsian result? Well, based on my comparative and historical research over these 20 plus years or so and the work of lots and lots of other people, my starting hypothesis is that what we might call social democratic capitalism is the most likely set of institutions and policies to achieve this result. What does it consist of? Well, it's within the framework of a market, mainly privately owned economy, but it has three distinctive characteristics. So one is expansive and generous public insurance. Expansive meaning it covers a lot of different risks. Generous meaning that each particular program is relatively generous as opposed to stingy. Second, and this distinguishes contemporary social democracy from its counterpart of a generation or so ago, it provides a lot of services and attention, even in the construction of its transfer programs, to employment. So the idea here is not to decommodify, to use Just Esping Andersen, a Danish sociologist's famous phrase in his Three Worlds of Welfare Capitalism book. It's not to allow people to live outside of the labor market comfortably at a decent standard. It's not that that's not a consideration, but it's instead to get as many people into work, to good work as possible. And then third, and this also would distinguish contemporary social democracy from its counterpart of a generation or so ago, there's a lot of attentiveness to not overdoing it on the regulation, especially of labor and product markets. This is where the characterization, the term that's used to characterize the Danish economy, or was about 10 or 15 years ago, flexicurity, that's where this comes from. So the idea is you provide a lot of cushions and supports for people who become unemployed or subject to one or another of the many risks that we encounter as humans in a modern economy. But you also don't try to constrain the actions of economic actors, whether workers or employers or others, more than you really need to. You sort of let the market work, not fully, but you try not to overdo it with the regulations, and then you provide these cushions and supports. Okay, the best exemplars here are the Nordic countries, especially Sweden and Denmark. I'll show you two pictures that get at this a little bit empirically. So along the horizontal axis here in this chart is a crude but not bad measure of the expansion and generosity of the welfare state or public insurance programs or social programs, whatever you want to call them. It's just the share spent on these programs, share of GDP spent on these programs, with a little bit of an adjustment for the elderly share of the population, for the unemployment rate, because both those things tend to jack up the spending more than we'd really want it to. There are other ways to measure the size and generosity of these programs. This isn't perfect, but it's not bad. Anyway, you see the usual suspects, the Nordic countries sort of to the right. Norway is kind of in the middle here. That's a little bit misleading because Norway's denominator in this calculation, GDP, is through the roof because of all its oil revenue. So Norway spends a lot of money. It has very generous, very expansive programs. It really belongs further over here, but anyway. The U.S. is somewhere over here, along with Japan, Australia, and a few others. So more generous and expansive, less generous and expansive. This is a measure of spending on public services as a share of GDP, subtracting out health and basic education, and it aims to get at that provision of services that are good or conducive for employment, active labor market policy, early education, stuff like that. And you can see the Nordic countries stand out here. They tend to be further to the right and tend to be higher. So these are two of those three characteristics or features of what I'm calling social democratic capitalism. Here's one other way to see this. Same thing on the horizontal axis, the public insurance generosity as a share of GDP. And now one measure of the degree of heaviness of regulation of product and labor markets. There are lots of different attempts to score this kind of thing. This is a commonly used one from the World Bank called the ease of doing business. And so higher on the vertical axis means less in the way of dense or heavy regulations and restrictions in product and labor markets. And so here are the Nordic countries over to the right, not the highest, but they're in this upper right quadrant, suggesting generous cushions and supports with modest, not super light, but modest regulations. I'm going to skip over that. This leaves out lots and lots of features of a typical political economy. I'm happy to talk more about any of these, but these are the ones that I want to focus on. Okay, so I'm going to show you some data, some patterns in the data in just a few moments, but here's a quick summary of what I think we see in the data for, again, the world. So I'm looking at 21 affluent, fairly long-standing democratic nations, roughly speaking over the period since 1960 or so, when data are available, with a heavier focus on the period since 1980 or so, when I think a lot of economic and other dynamics began to differ from the preceding period. So it looks to me like social democratic capitalism does in fact perform better on each of those three expanded Rawlsian criteria, better on income security, due largely to generous and expansive public insurance programs, and secondarily due to high employment. So high employment rates help reduce economic insecurity. If you're employed, you've got not only the programs, but also your earnings to rely on. If one goes, then you go to the programs. If you've got two earners in a household, then if one loses the job or takes time off temporarily, you've got a second one to fall back on. So that's a sense in which employment helps. But it's mainly a story of the public insurance programs. Social democratic capitalism seems to do better on a distribution favoring the least well-off. Same causal dynamics. That's mainly due to the public insurance programs, secondarily to a high employment rate. And it seems to be better on equality of opportunity, although here I think our data are less, maybe less reliable in terms of comparing across countries. And that seems to be due to early education and other services that are provided mainly by the government. It does, this set of institutions and policies seems to do average or better, probably, but at least average on employment, mainly because of the public services and the light regulation. The size of the welfare state may hurt a little bit on employment, although that's less clear now than it seemed to me and others to be a decade or a decade and a half ago. And it does just as well as other models or configurations of institutions on economic growth. Not better, as best I can tell. There are some hypotheses that suggest it might be better. I don't see that in the data. And it does at least as well or better on an array of other outcomes. Virtually all of the ones that I think we have comparable data on. Okay, so I'm focusing here on countries. This is not the only way to do this, but I'm most interested in institutions and policies for countries. I think we can learn lessons from subnational studies, but for better or worse, I'm going to focus on nations. Ideally here, in doing this test, we'd be able to do some kind of difference in difference design, so we'd be able to compare change across the countries. We don't have the data to allow us to do that for many of the indicators that I'm looking at, so a lot of the analysis, I'm going to show you some very simple pictures, but a lot of the analyses I've done are what I think of as sort of second best in terms of drawing useful inferences about the effects of these institutions and policies alone or in combination. Okay, here's I think the best simple picture to give you a sense of the story for income security. This is a measure that some researchers at the OECD have come up with that's akin to a measure that's becoming fairly widely used in studies of financial insecurity or security in the United States and some other rich countries. So this says take the households in the country who experience a sizable earnings loss from 1 year, the individuals who experience a sizable earnings loss from 1 year to the next. It's an earnings loss of, I think it's 20 or 25%. This is 20% or more. So you're earning $50,000 in year one. In year two, you're earning $40,000 or less. Maybe you take time off to have a kid. You're unemployed for a little while, whatever the reason. What fraction of those households where an individual experiences a sizable earnings loss does the household experience a comparable earnings loss? Now, if an individual becomes unemployed or experiences a drop in earnings, the pay drops, whatever, the household might not see its earnings drop by 20% because maybe there are two earners, so only one experiences a loss. Maybe the other one actually increases hours or gets another job, but also maybe some type of public insurance program kicks in, unemployment insurance, social assistance, pension, disability, lots and lots of possibilities here. What you see is a nice, strong correlation between the two. So countries that are, this is that same size of the welfare state, expansiveness and generosity of public insurance programs on the horizontal. And this is the share of households where a sizable earnings loss for an individual is coupled with a comparable earnings loss for the household. And so in South Korea and the US, about 2/3 of the time that happens. In the Nordic countries, it still happens, but only about a third of the time. So public insurance programs seem to do exactly what they are intended to do, which is enhance economic security. First and foremost, above reducing the Gini coefficient or lowering the poverty rate, these programs historically have been put in place to reduce economic insecurity. And lo and behold, if you look at these aggregate country-level data, we haven't had this kind of measure, amazingly, up until fairly recently. But it seems that this is one point in time. There are lots of possible other actual causes. It's just a bivariate scatter plot. But it confirms exactly what we'd expect would happen. As I said, a high employment rate also helps, but I'm going to move straight on to a distribution attentive to or favoring the least well-off. I think we can think about this in an absolute sense or a relative sense. In the US, we tend to use absolute poverty-type measures. In Europe, relative measures are much more common. Here's one absolute type of measure. It's a calculation of material deprivation rates. So most of these rich countries now have surveys which will ask people questions about not only their education, income, and so on, but their actual living standards. Was there a time in the last 6 months when you couldn't afford to pay the rent? Do you have holes in your windows that you can't afford to repair? Have you gone without seeing a doctor when you needed to because of the cost? These types of things. Is your neighborhood unsafe? Are you afraid walking within a mile of your house? So lots and lots of questions along these lines. This reflects one way of putting these together, again done by a researcher at the OECD. Higher numbers indicate more hardship, more deprivation. And you can see there's not a super strong, but a rough correlation between that and the public insurance generosity measure. Much stronger correlation with relative poverty rates, which are the norm in Europe and among a lot of comparative researchers. I have mixed feelings about them. So a relative poverty rate is essentially a measure of inequality in the lower half of the distribution. The poverty line is set at 50 or 60% of the median, and if the median's a lot higher, median household income, it's a lot higher in one country, then its poverty threshold is going to be high. Its poverty line is going to be higher, and that's going to alter the calculation in any case. So this is sort of an equality-based measure of poverty, but it correlates pretty strongly across these countries with, again, size and generosity of the welfare state. Once again, a high employment rate also helps, but not as much as the public social programs. So how do we measure equality of opportunity? Not easy, and most researchers throughout history, when they say they're measuring equality of opportunity, really they just look straight at outcomes because we don't have any straightforward, direct measure of equality of opportunity. Comparing across countries or over time within countries, most commonly nowadays we look at some sort of measure of intergenerational mobility. So to what degree are your earnings or household income similar to or different from your parents? And up until recently, what this really usually means is how similar to or different were they from your father, because the massive movement of women into the labor force skews this a bit if we want to go back over time. So father-son earnings correlations are pretty standard. Higher numbers on this axis, I've flipped the numbers here. So a larger number here is a smaller correlation. That means less association between your earnings and your parents. That, in principle, means that how you do in the labor market is less determined by what your dad's or your parents' income was, suggesting more intergenerational mobility, suggesting more equality of opportunity. Very indirect measure, but it's the best thing that we have comparing across countries. And what you can see is that this correlates with that measure I showed you earlier, which is the public service expenditures factoring out health and basic education. It kind of gets at employment promoting, or is intended to get at employment promoting public services. Another way to look at this is just focusing on early education expenditures. That's just one of these public services, but there's a lot of research nowadays that's linking this with equality of opportunity, both across countries and within countries. And there, too, you see a correlation. I worry about the cross-country comparability of these data. There are a couple of studies that have come out recently that look much more closely at the data for just two of these countries, and one of them concludes, for example, that there's just as much intergenerational mobility in the United States as there is in Sweden. I don't know that that's the last word on it, I just want to suggest to you that while this is consistent with the hypothesis that social democratic capitalism is good for equality of opportunity, I don't think this is nailed down by any stretch. And of course, again, this is a bivariate plot. But I worry more about the data. So now I'm going to turn to a bunch of other indicators, and rather than showing you some scatter plots where a particular element of what I'm calling social democratic capitalism is on the horizontal axis and an outcome is on the vertical, I'm going to show you patterns over time. The idea here being that it's the entire package, or different combinations of them. Maybe it's the size of the welfare state coupled with the employment promoting services. Or maybe it's the whole gestalt, as we say, that leads to the outcome rather than a specific element. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to show you the Nordic countries highlighted in red. The two solid lines are for Sweden and Denmark, which I think are really the best indicators because they pursued these policies for pretty consistently for a long period of time, much more so than Finland. Norway, we don't ever want to make any inferences from, I think, because it's so rich. And, a lefty might be inclined to say, well, it's rich because it's social democratic. It's rich because it has North Sea oil, maybe also because it's social democratic. But so it's suggestive, but don't put too much stock in it. In blue are Belgium and France. These are two countries that stand clearly apart from the Nordics, I think, especially in the employment promoting services, but also in the heaviness of the regulation. So big welfare state, just as robust and expansive as in any of the Nordic countries, but they pursue a very different approach from this social democratic capitalism. Okay, so the Nordics aren't necessarily world beaters when it comes to employment rates. They were back in the 1970s, 1980s. Some other countries have caught up. This, I think, is in part because more countries have moved to emulate their set of policies. Very good on female employment, and that's been one of the targets. These family-friendly employment-promoting policies like early education or child care, preschool, paid parental leave, and so on have facilitated female employment. They also do pretty good, but not universally the best, on employment among the near elderly, which is a big source of the variation across countries. Do lots of people drop out or retire early or not? So employment rate's a pretty standard way to think about employment, and I think it's valuable, but we also have data on hours, and there are some countries that have high employment rates, but a lot of people working very short hours. So the Netherlands is the classic case in point here. Went from a pretty low employment rate country in the 1970s to a very high employment rate country by the 1990s and still today, but a lot of people in the Netherlands work 10 hours a week or so. And from the point of view of funding public social programs, if nothing else, maybe that's a problem because the deal here is you want a lot of people in paid employment so you can tax them, so you can fund all these cushions and supports. But if everybody's only working 5 or 10 hours a week, then yes, they're employed, but there's not going to be as much money to tax away. So anyway, I think we want to at least consider this. And when you do this, so this is annual hours worked per person who is employed. The Nordic countries look middle to low. But this is partly a vacation and holiday story. It's not only working 10 hours a week instead of 40 or 35. It's how many weeks off do you have during the year? And so there's no real straightforward way to get around this, but I just want to show you that what I think we really want is a high employment. If you embrace what I've suggested here, what I'm recommending we really want is a high employment rate, modest work hours, but not too high. And one indicator of that is the share of people working insane hours, 50 hours a week or more. Now, I probably do that, but I do it purely honestly, by choice. I love what I do. I feel very fortunate about it. Many of the people who are working 50 hours or more in these countries are not doing it so much by choice. Some of them are, working on Wall Street, and they know they're going to do it for 5 or 10 years and make $1 gazillion and then move on to something else. But here the Nordic countries do better. Okay, economic growth. One of the key contributors to just going to show you this. The Nordic countries have done fine on economic growth. This is log of GDP per capita, so it shows you the rate of growth. Here's Norway, the world beater. The other ones have done just fine, and you can look both across countries at a point in time. You can look at change across these countries. You can look at long periods over time within these countries. So here's Denmark, goes from a kind of small to moderate government, size of government country in the early 20th century to a big government country now. This is log of GDP per capita, basically follows a straight line. There's no tailing off as the government gets bigger and bigger. Same is true in Sweden, same is true even in the United States. We go from a kind of small government to medium-sized government country. No substantial change in the rate of economic growth. All of the evidence points to, I mean, if you work really hard, you can come up with some micro evidence or particular events in history where size of government leads to slowdowns in economic growth. But the broad patterns across and within countries over time suggest no reason to think that at 50 to 55% of GDP, government turns out to be an impediment. I'm going to skip this and show you just a few other outcomes. This is a happiness measure. Nordic countries look good. Life expectancy, they're fine, although Denmark, too many people smoke in Denmark still, so it's not super high. Healthy life expectancy, they do a bit better. In Finland, I don't know, maybe too much grunge metal music in Finland is causing problems there. They're not world beaters on the latest PISA scores, but at the same time, they've zoomed ahead of us, in fact, in college graduation. So we used to be up at the top. And here's, again, Norway, but even the other ones now are graduating more of a given cohort than, well, Sweden lags slightly behind the U.S. Safety, they do fine, except in Finland. Another safety measure. Income inequality, it won't surprise any of you probably that they're low. Wealth inequality, pretty low. They do fine on family. A common assertion is that big welfare state reduces the incentive for people to commit to long-term relationships. No cross-country evidence to support that. Same with civic engagement, Robert Putnam bowling alone type measure. So a very common assertion by skeptics of big government is that it reduces the need for participation in all kinds of intermediary organizations, and those have good spillover effects. We just don't see that in the cross-country data. There's a lot of trust in these societies. They're okay on immigration, although not great, but Sweden now has a higher foreign-born share than the United States. That surprises some people. Still, Finland and Denmark do not. And this is a big problem area, I'll suggest, for Denmark. Not surprisingly, they're pretty good on the environment. And really importantly, they pay their bills. So they spend a lot, but they generate the tax revenue to pay for it. So Denmark, Sweden, Finland have among the lowest public net debt of any country. If I put Norway on the chart, it would be down here. They have like a negative 200% of GDP. They have a huge surplus, in other words. Freedom, I'm not going to bother going into that. Okay. I'm happy to come back to it if you have questions. So my tentative conclusion, social democratic capitalism, if we think of what exists in Denmark and Sweden and to a lesser extent the other Nordic countries as social democratic capitalism, it's not superior on every outcome that we probably should care about. But it does seem to be better on these ones that comprise what I'm calling an expanded Rawlsian view of what should be prioritized. Economic security, equality of opportunity, distributional outcomes favoring the least well-off. It also seems to do better, as well as or better on employment, just as well on economic growth and on virtually every other thing that we ought to care about. Now, there are lots of questions that could be asked about this, holes that one could poke in the argument. I'm going to mostly let you do this, but I've got a big section. I'm just going to warn you, I've got a big section of charts and evidence in here, so I'm sort of prepared to push back. Let me just mention one quickly. Why should we care about the least well-off more than the upper middle class? I think the question answers itself, but there are people who ask this kind of question. And if you look at, let's say, income at the 75th percentile or above, by the way, the United States looks really good. So if you think that this deserves a lot of priority, then, is social democratic capitalism so great? Maybe not. I will, though, mention that at that 75th percentile or above, probably at least through the 95th, in the Nordic countries, your kid's tuition is free in college. You get nearly free health care. That's really good. And you get very affordable, really good early education, preschool, and child care. How much that affects your life obviously depends on whether you have kids or not. The health care doesn't, but the college and the early education. So anyway, it's not quite as clear as this suggests. But this does suggest a big difference, right? This is Sweden, about $50,000 a year at the 50th percentile. In the United States, it's around $75,000. That's a big difference in income. So if you care about this, or if this is a cautionary tale, then okay. All right. Because I want to stop at a quarter till, let me just say a couple more things. So one of the books that I've written fairly recently, it was published in 2014, is called Social Democratic America. And in it, I discuss a lot about what I think of as the social democratic model. So what I've shown you here is building on that book in part, but I also have a chapter that essentially argues that I think this is where we're likely to go. All apparent evidence to the contrary, but I do actually believe this, and it's not just a belief or opinion. It's, I think, fairly well worked through set of considerations about why 50 years from now the United States is much more likely to look like Denmark and Sweden look today in terms of its set of public programs and policies than the United States today. Just as a sort of simple thought experiment, the United States today looks more like Sweden and Denmark today than like the United States 100 years ago with respect to expansiveness and generosity of our public insurance program. Doesn't mean that the last century is necessarily a good predictor of how things will play out over the next 50 years, but it's worth pondering. Okay. I also just want to mention quickly that for all those who think nothing can possibly happen in the United States at this terrible moment in time, and when I say that, I even mean before November of 2016. There's reason to be skeptical about any good thing getting passed, except in very rare circumstances like 2009 when the Democrats have a filibuster-proof majority in the House and the presidency. And yet, there is stuff going on in parts of the United States, including in a state that's very racially and ethnically diverse, that has not terribly strong labor unions, that's big, not small. These are all points that are often made about, oh, you're talking about Denmark and Sweden. They got like 5 million people. They're all white. It's easy to do that kind of stuff. You could never do it here in the United States. Well, you can do some of it, apparently. We live in a state which has done some of it recently. That doesn't end the conversation. It's, again, just suggestive. I'll come back to the taxes thing. I don't want to go into this. I'm going to stop. Thank you very much.
For questions.
Yes, go ahead. You want me to call or somebody?